everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be diving into Brené Brown's Daring Greatly.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, have you read this one?
I have read this one.
Yeah.
I really love Brené Brown's work. It's
Mhm.
very approachable and I think really connects with people.
It really does. And this one, Daring Greatly, I think really is about like the core of like how to show up as yourself and be okay with being like a flawed human.
Right. And how to kind of embrace those imperfections.
Yeah.
And I think she does a great job in this book of kind of normalizing those things.
Absolutely. And that's I think what I love so much about her work too is that it's not just like fluffy self-help, it's like she's a researcher.
Right.
She like brings the data.
She's got the background. Yeah, she's a qualitative researcher, so she did hundreds of interviews with people talking about, shame and vulnerability, and really kind of dug into the data to understand what does it really mean to live what she calls a wholehearted life.
I love that.
Hmm.
And so that's what I want to like dig into a little bit today with you because she has all this research and all this data backing up kind of her framework for thinking about this. And so the thing I'm so curious about is like she really tackles these two big concepts, vulnerability and shame. What are those? Like, how does she define those based on all these interviews? Because I think sometimes we have like a picture in our mind of what those words mean, but she kind of unpacks them a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I think there's a lot of baggage that comes with both of those words. And so vulnerability, for example, she really defines as uncertainty, risk, emotional exposure. It's really about putting yourself out there in a way that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And that can be really scary.
Oh, absolutely. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
To not know, to be like, well, I'm just going to put this out there and I don't know if people are going to love it or hate it. Like, that is so scary.
And I think it's interesting because when we think about vulnerability, we often think about it as a weakness.
Right.
But she really flips that script and says, no, actually, it's a strength. Because it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable.
Absolutely.
To put yourself out there, to risk rejection.
Yeah, because the opposite is just staying in your little, like, safe, tiny bubble and never,
Exactly. It's about stepping outside of that comfort zone.
Yeah.
And being willing to be seen for who you really are.
So then where does shame fit into that? Because you're talking about like the uncertainty and the risk of like, oh, are people going to judge this? Are they going to, whatever. And then shame is like a whole other level of like, oh my God, this is bad.
Yeah. And shame is that intensely painful feeling that we are flawed, unworthy, not good enough.
Oh, it's the worst.
Yeah, it's awful. And it's often triggered by vulnerability.
Oh, interesting.
So when we put ourselves out there and things don't go as planned or when we feel exposed or rejected, that's when shame can really rear its ugly head.
Oh, totally. It's like that fear of like, if I put myself out there and it goes badly, then it's proof that I'm not good enough.
Right.
And that is like, shame just like wraps itself around you.
And it makes you want to hide. It makes you want to disappear and never come out again.
Totally. And I think one of the things that I love so much about Brown's work is that she's so willing to be vulnerable herself, like in her writing.
Absolutely.
She shares these like really personal stories about times when she's felt shame or she's felt vulnerable. And I'm thinking specifically about that story she tells about accidentally sending an angry email to the wrong person.
Oh, yeah.
Like, can you imagine?
Oh, the horror.
And then the way that the person responded, like just piled on the shame.
Yes.
It was just like, oh, it was so relatable in like the worst way, But it was so powerful because it's like, if Brené Brown can send an angry email to the wrong person and like survive it, then like maybe I can survive my, dumb mistakes too.
And that's what makes her work so powerful, is that she's not afraid to be vulnerable to show her own imperfections. And in doing so, she gives us permission to do the same.
Yes.
It's like she's saying, hey, we're all human here. We all screw up. We all feel shame.
Yeah. And that is such a relief because I think so often shame thrives on secrecy, right? It's like this thing that we think we're the only ones experiencing.
It tells us we're the only ones going through it. But the truth is, it's a universal experience.
It's so universal. And like, that's why it's so important to talk about it. It's like that saying, you're only as sick as your secrets.
Absolutely.
When we bring it out into the open, that's when it starts to lose its power over us.
And I think the research really backs that up.
Oh, does?
Yeah, there's this researcher, James Pennebaker, who has done some really fascinating work on expressive writing. And he found that when people write about their traumatic experiences, they actually have improvements in both their mental and physical health.
Oh. So it's not just about feeling better emotionally. It's like it has actual tangible health benefits.
Exactly. And it really speaks to the importance of creating space for vulnerability in our lives.
Yeah.
Because when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to share our stories, to connect with others on a deeper level, we open ourselves up to a whole new world of possibility.
Wow. Yeah, it's not just about surviving shame, it's about like thriving.
Exactly.
Like what does that look like to really like step into that?
Right.
And I think that's where this idea of daring greatly comes in.
Yes.
What does she mean by that?
So Brown found that one of the biggest obstacles to daring greatly is what she calls our shields. And this is really how we protect ourselves from vulnerability in these shields. While they may make us feel safe in the short term, they ultimately prevent us from experiencing true connection and joy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's talk about these shields.
Okay.
What are they? So these shields, what are they? Like, how do they actually show up in our lives?
Well, she outlines three main ones.
Yeah.
There's foreboding joy, perfectionism, and numbing.
Oh.
And I think all three of those are really relatable
Oh, yeah.
in different ways for all of us, probably.
Yeah, definitely. Let's start with that first one, because that's a weird one to think about. Like, foreboding joy? Like, what is that?
So foreboding joy is that thing where something good happens, but then we immediately brace ourselves for the bad thing.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to happen, to counteract it.
Like, you get the promotion, but then you're like, oh my God, they're going to work me to death and it's going to be terrible.
Right, exactly. Or like you meet someone, you're like, oh, this is amazing, but I know it's not going to last.
Yeah.
Or like you get a new car and you're like, oh, when's this going to break down?
Yeah. It's like you can't even enjoy the good thing.
Right.
Because you're so busy, like, prepping for it to be taken away.
Yes. And I think that goes back to that scarcity mindset that we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
where it's like if something good happens, we can't just enjoy it
Yeah.
because we're so used to having to fight for everything.
Oh, yeah. We're just waiting for that other shoe to drop.
Exactly. And so it's like we're almost afraid to let ourselves be too happy.
Totally. And it's so interesting that Brown connects that back to shame.
Right.
Because it's like, if we don't believe that we're worthy of good things, then when we get them, it's like, oh, this doesn't compute.
Right.
Like, I need to find a way to, push this away or, protect myself from the disappointment that I'm sure is coming.
Exactly. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
It totally is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Okay. So foreboding joy. Check, been there, done that. What about perfectionism?
Yeah. I think perfectionism is a big one for a lot of people.
Huge.
And it's really tricky because on the surface, it looks like striving for excellence,
Right.
which is something that we often praise in our society.
Absolutely. Especially in school and stuff.
Yeah.
You get praised for being the perfect student.
Exactly. But Brown's research actually found that perfectionism is more about trying to protect ourselves from shame and judgment.
Ooh, interesting.
It's like if we can just be perfect, if we can just do everything right, then no one can criticize us.
Yeah.
No one can hurt us.
We're safe.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's really driven by fear.
Oh, it totally is. It's this fear of if I'm not perfect, then I'm not lovable.
Yes.
If I'm not perfect, then I'm going to be rejected.
Exactly. And it's exhausting.
Oh, so exhausting. Because you can never actually be perfect
Right.
because it doesn't exist.
Exactly. It's an illusion.
It's a moving target. Yeah.
And so we're constantly striving for something that we can never actually achieve.
Which just keeps us feeling like crap.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we're not good enough.
Exactly. And then that's where that third shield comes in, right? Numbing.
Yes.
It's like, okay, if I'm going to feel like crap no matter what, then I might as well just numb it out.
Exactly. So numbing is any behavior that we use to avoid feeling uncomfortable emotions.
Yeah, what kinds of things? Give me some examples.
Yeah. So it can be things like drinking too much or using drugs,
Right.
but it can also be things like working too much
Oh, yeah.
or scrolling through social media for hours.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I'm so guilty of that.
Right? Like anything that kind of helps us to check out.
Yeah, to just turn off the brain for a minute and not feel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's really tricky because a lot of these behaviors are things that are socially acceptable or even encouraged,
Right.
like working hard.
Yeah, hustle culture.
Yes, exactly.
And-
Hustle culture.
You're supposed to be grinding all the time.
Right. But the problem is when these behaviors become our primary way of coping with stress and difficult emotions.
So how do we know where's the line? Because you're saying, these are things that are socially acceptable and even encouraged. So how do we know when it's too much? When we've crossed the line from oh, I'm just, blowing off some steam to actually I'm numbing in a way that's not healthy.
That's such a good question. And I think it's really about looking at the intention behind the behavior.
Okay.
So if you're, having a glass of wine at the end of a long day and you're really present
Yeah.
and you're enjoying it,
Yeah.
that's different than if you're downing a bottle of wine every night
Mm.
to avoid dealing with your feelings.
Right.
And so it's really about checking in with yourself and being honest about your motivations.
Yeah, and like, how are you feeling afterwards? Like, are
That's
you feeling refreshed and like you actually took care of yourself, or are you feeling worse?
exactly. And I think that's a really good distinction
Yeah.
because self-care is supposed to make us feel good. It's supposed to nourish us and energize us.
Yeah.
And so if we're engaging in behaviors that are actually leaving us feeling more depleted and disconnected, then it might be a sign that we're actually numbing.
Oh, that's such a good way to think about it. So yeah, it's not just about the behavior itself. It's really about like the intention behind it and like how it's actually making us feel. So we've got all these shields that we build up, but how do we like actually start living differently? Do we just like rip the Band-Aid off and be like, okay, world, here's all my vulnerability, come and get it?
Well, that's one approach. But Brown talks about building what she calls shame resilience, which is like, it's a practice, right? It's not like you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm shame-proof.
It would be amazing though if it worked like that.
Right, right. Like, give me all the vulnerability. But it is something that you build up over time. And actually, one of the most foundational practices that she talks about is gratitude.
Gratitude. Okay, I feel like gratitude comes up a lot, but it's easy to be like, yeah, gratitude, I get it. So like, really, why is it so important in this context?
Well, I think when we were talking about foreboding joy and that scarcity mindset, gratitude is such a powerful antidote to that.
Yeah.
When we are so focused on what's wrong or what we're lacking or what could go wrong, it's really hard to be brave. And so gratitude helps us shift our attention to what's already present, like the good, what we can appreciate right now in this moment.
So it's like instead of scanning for threats, you're training your brain to see the good, which then frees you up to like actually take a risk.
Exactly. It's not that you're ignoring the bad stuff or pretending it's not there.
Yeah.
It's just that you're choosing to focus on the good, too.
Mm,
And there's so much research now about the benefits of gratitude.
right.
Like, it can actually change your brain chemistry.
Oh, wow. Okay, so gratitude check. What else helps us build this like shame resilience that we're talking about?
Another big one is boundaries.
Ooh, boundaries. Those are tough.
They can be really tough.
Yeah.
Especially if you're someone who, like, really wants to please people.
Mm.
But boundaries are essential for, one, protecting our own well-being, like our emotional well-being, but they're also really important for creating that space for us to be vulnerable.
Okay, I get that. But how do you actually get better at setting boundaries? Like, what does that even look like?
Well, I think it starts with identifying situations or relationships that consistently leave you feeling drained or resentful or like you're not being heard.
So knowing your triggers, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
Yeah.
what are those things that really set you off? And then once you know what those are, you can start to ask yourself, okay, what do I need to feel safe and respected in those situations? What are my non-negotiables?
Oh, I like that. Non-negotiables.
Right. Like, what are those things that you're just not willing to budge on? And then once you know what those are, communicate them. And it doesn't have to be aggressive. It could just be like, hey, this is what I need.
Yeah, that makes sense. Easier said than done, but I'm picking up what you're putting down. Okay, so we've got gratitude, boundaries. What about that voice in our head? You know, the one that's like, you're not good enough, you're going to mess this up, everyone's judging you. How do we deal with that?
That is the inner critic, and we all have one.
Hmm.
But we don't have to let it run the show. One of the most powerful things we can do is to practice self-compassion. And I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but what it really means is treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a close friend.
Oh man, why is that so much harder than it sounds?
Right. It's so much easier to be compassionate to other people than to ourselves. But the next time you find yourself like really in that spiral of self-criticism, just pause and ask yourself, would I say this to a friend?
Oh, that's good. Like, would you ever be that harsh to someone you love?
Right. Probably not. So why are we doing to ourselves?
Yeah.
We deserve that same compassion.
So much good stuff here. This has been amazing.
It's really all about recognizing that we're all in this together, Like, we all have those insecurities, we all make mistakes, we all have those moments of self-doubt.
It's like that saying, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. So be kind.
Exactly. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others. It makes a world of difference.
This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for diving into this with me.
Of course, this was fun.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us on another deep dive. We'll see you next time.